Good morning. Before we get started, Jay, can you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this opportunity this morning to come together and continue to study your word. Lord, please bring Jeff a ready recollection of all those things he's studied this past week that help us understand the spreading of your word throughout the world in the first century so that we can do your work here in the 21st century. Lord, again, let us all take this word to heart so that we can go do your will. All this in your Son's most holy name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. All right, we're going to pick up with, we're going to move more into kind of how Paul goes from Philippi to Thessalonians, the account of Paul's time in Thessalonica from Acts. So Acts is pretty clear. Paul leaves Philippi after being beaten and jailed, and he, Silas, and Timothy take a route that is across the Ignatian Way, which we talked about last week, is the major east-west highway in the Roman communication and transportation system. And it runs pretty much from what I would call Eastern Roman Empire to the Western Roman Empire. It's the main link between those two. So when Paul leaves Philippi, he stops at two very logical cities along the way. And they're up there. You can pronounce them as you see fit. The total trip is about 92 miles. So, yeah, depending on Paul and his travel companions' timing, that could take anywhere from 3 to 5 days. And that's, if you were going to go on the Roman highway system from Philippi to Thessalonica, you would stop at those two cities. It's a very logical pattern. It says Paul and Silas and Timothy, preach there, but it's an interesting thing, and you can kind of draw it from all of Paul's writings. He does not mention going to a synagogue. So all historians will tell you that when he doesn't mention that, that means there is no synagogue in that city. So, and then if you go through all of Paul's writings, there's a pretty consistent pattern there. One of the things that is apparent is does not accompany them on this portion of the journey. And the reason we know that, if you look at the writings in Acts, when Luke is with them, he uses the term we. He drops the we starting on the trip from Philippi to Thessalonica, and he picks up the we vocabulary in chapter 20. So, once again, most historians will tell you Luke was not a part of this portion of the journey. And just kind of from a perspective, we're going to hit on briefly a couple of books. We have the writings of Acts, we have the writings of Thessalonians, and then we're going to see one of the people on the journey mentioned in Peter. So the first thing you have to know is the earliest book by some margin in that writing are the letters from Thessalonica. You can pick your historical perspective, but most historians will tell you the Thessalonian letters were written 50 A.D. So then you have a wide variety of dates for Acts, but let's just go with the earliest one. So it's going to be 60 to 62. So you've got 12 years that have passed from when Paul writes his letter to the Thessalonians to when Luke recounts the journey in Acts. So a lot of time has passed. The letters have been passed along. Acts has got a separate purpose than the letters to the Thessalonians. And then we're briefly going to deal with a reference of Silas in 1 Peter. Now, that's written almost, according to historians, at about the same time as Acts. So you've got this period where you've got the things of Thessalonians, and then you've got 12 years before the other two books that we're briefly going to touch. Thessalonians is one of the earliest letters Paul wrote. There's some You can Google it yourself, but it's either the first or the second letter that Paul wrote. Got to keep these synced up to this week. Okay. Paul's ministry in Thessalonica starts in the synagogue. And he does this, there are several writings where it says very unequivocally, when Paul arrives in the city, he starts at a synagogue if they have one. And I'll give you references to some other places where that comes up. It says he was there for 3 Sabbaths. Okay, so I'm going to just give you this information. I don't think it affects your salvation one way or the other, but I'm going to give you the information. A lot of what I will call the Church of Christ commentaries want you to believe that Paul was only in Thessalonica for 3 weeks. Okay? They then will explain away the next references I give you. After studying this, I really don't think you can use Luke as the ultimate reference on this, but once again, you can read the commentaries and them explaining away the next set of verses I'm going to go over with you. The first thing is, in 1 Thessalonians 1:9, Paul states that they turned them away from idols. Now, obviously, he's speaking to Gentiles here. Yeah. Whether that can be done in 3 weeks, you can determine on your own. The next one he said is in Philippians chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. And this is Paul writing that while he was in Thessalonica, he received from the church in Philippi multiple donations. Okay. Once again, if you're going to get support from the Philippians and church while you're in Thessalonica, the concept that you get those donations in 3 weeks, for my own purposes, seemed pretty far-fetched. Okay? But, once again, read the commentaries who want to go with Acts. Paul's established a trade, which is very clear while in his time in Thessalonica. There's 2 very specific references. He deals with it in 1 Thessalonians 2:9, and he deals with it in 2 Thessalonians. Okay, if you're going to establish a trade and you're going to preach night and day, you don't do that in 3 weeks. At least, once again, I'm giving you Jeff's opinion. And then lastly, it says in 1 Thessalonians 5, he appointed leaders in the church in Thessalonica. So, once again, you can draw your own conclusion. I don't think the purpose of Acts is to give you a detailed historical reference for all of Paul's timing. I think it tries to give you an overview of the establishment of the church and then Paul's missionary journeys. But, once again, some commentators completely disagree. I'll let you draw your own conclusion. We know who was on this section of the journey. We know 3 people who were on this journey. It was Paul, Silas, and Timothy. And it talks about, they were under tremendous opposition. And this is a continuing theme. We talked about last week how Paul arrives in Thessalonica. He and Silas get beaten. And that's where we learn that Paul and Silas are Roman citizens. But the likelihood is that that's what happened to them in Philippi has been communicated to the folks in Thessalonica. And the Jews can continue the pattern they've always had. But I want to take a moment and make sure everybody understands the background of the 2 people that are with Paul. I think most of us know who Timothy is. There's a lot more writings on who Timothy is. We know, and I can share these with you. I didn't put them in the notes, but I just want to go through them because it's important to know who's with him and what their roles are. Timothy is met in Lystra. We know that his mother and grandmother were Jewish and believers, and faithful, I should say. His dad was a Greek. He follows Paul throughout his journeys, and Paul considers him a son, as we can see in numerous writings, and that Timothy is really kind of his right-hand man throughout his journeys. We know that he probably struggled with some health issues, and we also get the sense, because of Paul's writing, that Timothy is a rather reserved person. He's not near as aggressive and flamboyant as Barnabas. Silas, we don't really know as much about. He was circumcised because of his, for lack of a better word, his Jewish heritage. And in order for him to go into the temple and preach in the synagogue, with Paul, he had to be circumcised. So we know he got circumcised, and we know he was with Paul on his second and third missionary journeys. He was imprisoned during Paul's first imprisonment. He was with Paul when Paul was imprisoned. And Paul's final request, which we see in 1 Corinthians 2, chapter 1, verses 1 and 9, and then later in Acts, was for Timothy to join him in Rome before he dies. That was his wish. We don't know if it occurred or not. The churches that we know Timothy was a part of, obviously he's at Thessalonica, which we're talking about here. He was definitely in Corinth during Silas's and Paul's 1.5-year stay there. He's at Philippi, which we talked about. He's at the next port that Paul and Silas leave after they go from Thessalonica into Berea, and he's at the church in Ephesus. So that gives you the background on Timothy. So Timothy is kind of Paul's shadow. He's kind of the person that Paul, like he says himself, views as a son. So then we have Silas. Silas we know a lot less about. The first time we see him is in Acts chapter 15. And hopefully everyone remembers the council at Jerusalem, where Barnabas and Paul come back from their first missionary journey with the Gentiles being the subject matter. And, what do we do with the Gentiles? What do they have to remember? What do they have to follow associated with the Jewish law? Which is where one of the greatest quotes in the New Testament is, where I forget if it was James or Peter, but their conclusion was, why would I ask the Gentiles to follow something that we utterly failed at? So they just limited very closely what the Gentiles had to do. And at that time, we all know that there's a letter written, but I think, at least for me, I kind of pass over the fact that when Paul and Barnabas are sent back out, the Jerusalem church sent along 2 people with them, so that Paul and Barnabas had authority from the Jerusalem church. Those 2 people are Silas and a person that we'll just refer to as Judas. He has another name, but I didn't want to write it down. So he goes with them and validates and teaches and preaches, and they say that Silas is a prophet and that he has put his life at risk for the church while in Jerusalem. That's all in the letter that goes out to the churches with Paul and Barnabas. And he's out teaching and preaching in the churches with Paul and Barnabas, attesting to what's going on in Jerusalem and how the Jerusalem church is growing. He also returns from Paul and Barnabas back to Jerusalem. And we see that very clearly in the Romans chapter 15. Then we know the next time we see Silas is after Paul and Barnabas have their split over John Mark. And once again, I always like to point this out. This wasn't an amiable split. It was a violent split. The word that's used is sharp or divisive or rent asunder. I have heard people say that they came to a logical conclusion and separated peacefully. Well, okay, that may be true, but that's not what the letter says. So draw your own conclusions. But Silas now goes on the second missionary journey with Paul. And like I said, he follows Paul up into Berea. He does not go to Athens with Paul. He stays behind in Macedonia. And then he hooks back up with Paul in Corinth. And he is there for the year and a half that Paul and Silas preach and teach in Corinth. So, by best guesses, he probably spent somewhere between 2 and 3 years with Paul. And that's kind of really all we know about Silas. He's kind of a, if you ever try and run any organization, you need people who can kind of be glue people, who are in the background. They just get a lot of stuff done. The conclusion of reading about Silas is he's that guy. I mean, he's around, he's critical, he's important, and he's just there. And everything works well while he's around. The next time we see Silas is in 1 Peter chapter 5. And it's the end of the book. And Peter says very clearly that Silas helped write the letter and then was his courier. Now, once again, I would say all the historians I read believe that is the same Silas as you see on Paul's missionary journey. A couple of the commentators that I read didn't agree, but most of the historians, because of the way he's referenced, both his Greek and his Latin name, and the way he is just kind of accepted, make it very clear that he was with Peter. So once again, we go from his time in Corinth, which probably ends somewhere, some historians will give you a blank, but let's just go with the latest date of 54 AD. And then Peter writes this letter, like I said, somewhere around 62 AD. So nothing is known about Silas for that 7 to 8 year period, but based upon the two bookends that we have, Silas very much appears to be a guy who works with the apostles and helps establish and communicate the message throughout the New Testament churches. So, any questions before we get off of Timothy and Silas? Okay. Yes. Okay. The church in Thessalonica, as we see in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 6, is established around affliction. It's not just Silas and Paul who are being persecuted. The church itself is being persecuted. There are, in Acts chapter 17, which we'll get into the reading, it's very clear that the Jews and the Gentiles both are trying to attack this church. This is not unusual. It's the same exact thing that happened in Philippi. The Jewish involvement in Thessalonica is mentioned in both places. It's mentioned in Acts and it's mentioned in Thessalonians. So not really any doubt that they were involved in the conspiracy. They upped the charges in Thessalonica on Paul. They actually say that Paul is trying to create a revolt or a riot in Rome, in Thessalonica. Okay. You just have to understand, under Roman law and Roman occupation theory, if that charge is made and validated, you're dead. That was their view of any uprising. Somebody's got to die. So the church in Thessalonica clearly understood that they could not personally attack Silas and Paul. They learned their lesson from Philippi. These guys are Roman citizens, and we have to go through the Roman process. We, the people of Thessalonica, do not want to do anything to damage our relationship with Rome. So, next. Okay. So the first thing Paul does when he arrives in Thessalonica is go to the synagogue. I told you I'd give you references where that happens elsewhere. The easy ones for me was chapter 13, verse 5 of Acts, 14, 5 and 14 of chapter 13, chapter 14, verse 1, and then very specifically in Berea and Athens, it states when Paul arrives, he goes to the synagogue. Which is, when you think about it, Paul has the permission to do that because he's over 18, he's Jewish. But he has even better credentials. He was an enforcer for the Jews early on in his life before the miraculous conversion. And he studied at the feet of Gamaliel. Okay. We kind of pass over that, but most of the historians will tell you studying at the feet of Gamaliel is like getting a degree from Harvard. Okay. This is not something that is given out lightly. Paul's credentials are understood, and his understanding of the Old Testament and the Jewish law is unquestioned. So when Paul shows up in a city, he doesn't lack for opportunity. So we know that that's where he starts out, and we know it goes over, as we said, 3 Sabbaths. So after preaching in the synagogues, something happens because it's very apparent that the people who make up the letters that are being written to the Thessalonians by Paul, he's writing to a predominantly Gentile group. So he gets kicked out of the synagogues, and in Paul's case, in Luke's case, leaves the city. Well, not really sure what happened in between. Because how do you go from just preaching in the synagogues to having a predominantly Greek church? Something happened. And Paul obviously was out and about outside the synagogue converting non-Jews. And, the message with the Jews always falls on deaf ears when Paul starts talking about a risen Jesus. The Jews don't believe in resurrection. The Sadducees do, but they are not the predominant group of the Jews. Andy? Pharisees. Sorry. Sadducees are okay with it. Pharisees are not. So as soon as Paul starts talking about the risen Jesus, divisions happen and threats occur. It's a very forward process with Paul and his preaching, which makes you wonder why he keeps going to the synagogues. I mean, he knows he's going to take a beating, but he keeps doing it. That's his pattern, and he continues with it. Paul gets to Macedonia. I probably needed to put this letter earlier in my outline, but we kind of pass over something, at least I do. He goes to Macedonia because he has a dream. It doesn't appear that was really on his initial itinerary. And Acts chapter 16 tells us about the dream. Like I said before, both letters are very clear that it is a predominantly Gentile church. And it talks about this process where he works night and day, okay? And so I was curious about, is there any historical writings about this phenomenon where a guy gets kicked out of the synagogue, and how does he preach in a city? And I found this reference. There were several of them, but Celsus is the last bullet point on there, was the most interesting to me. And Celsus hates Christians, okay? So just understand, that's his perspective when writing. Clear that what was happening in the New Testament church is people would be at a job They would have established a business, and in their normal commerce, they would preach, they would teach, they would have people come in and sit with them and tell them about Christianity. He viewed that as a huge threat to the Jewish method. Children are supposed to be taught at home. People are supposed to learn about the Old Testament history in the synagogue. This concept of people learning in the marketplace was a huge threat. And that, when you look at all the writings of Paul, that seems to be the most logical explanation of how he taught the Gentiles. So he establishes his trade. We know that Paul's trade is a tent maker. And when you look that up, it's actually, he was more likely a leather worker, as more broadly than just a tent maker. And so it appears that Paul, and in this case Silas and Timothy, would be establishing their trade and talking to all the merchants and all the people who want to learn about Christ. Keeping everything synchronized here. I covered you all last week. If we look at Acts, and we're going to go into that now, the first group to convert are Jews. So let's just turn to Acts chapter 17. Starting in verse 1. When they had passed through, as I said, you can read the two cities, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As his custom was, Paul went to the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Christ. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of the God-fearing Greeks, and not a few prominent women. Okay, so the first converts to establishing the church in Thessalonica were Jews, and then the word God-fearing Greeks, most commentators will tell you, and most historians will tell you, are Greeks who have become Jews. Okay, so these are not unbelievers to the Old Testament law. These are Greeks who have become Jewish. And then the last one is pretty much a pattern that we see throughout Paul's teaching, and Lydia is a perfect example in Philippi. Prominent women. So they kind of become the cornerstone of Paul's church. And I think sometimes we kind of pass over that. The women kind of become the cornerstone of the New Testament church in a number of the cities where Paul preaches. Any questions? Okay. Moving on to verse 5. But the Jews were jealous, so they rounded up bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot. To Jason's church of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. So, the Jews, being like the Jews are, they round up some bad characters. I don't know what anybody else has a different translation than bad characters. But some of the translations say ruffians. Some of them say anybody else, what other words do you have besides bad characters? So there's a pretty broad. Troublemakers. I'm sorry? Wicked. What'd you say, Jim? Okay. So, as you can see, so the Jews are going to take the worst of the worst in the city and create a problem. That's what they do. It's not like they try and reason. It's not like they try and go to the respected members of Thessalonica. As we've talked about, they have their own unique structure. That's not their process. They are not going to go to those people. They are not going to go through the Roman courts. They're going to take people. Jim, what was yours again? There you go. They're going to go to them, and they're going to create a riot. Okay? And they know, the Jews know, at the first sign of a riot, the people who are in charge of Thessalonica will come down hard because they don't have Roman involvement in this city. It doesn't become a Roman colony for another couple of decades. It is an independent city run by independent people who have a great relationship with Rome. So they've got to do something, and they've got to do something quick. And in Luke's account, they go looking for Paul and Silas. Can't find them. So he's staying with Jason, so they grab Jason. And this is where Luke to really quickly summarize things. In verse 6, but when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some of other brothers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are defying Caesar's decree by saying there is another king, one called Jesus." Okay. Once again, they don't take things into their own hands. They clearly have learned from Philippi that that's not an action that's going to set well for them. They cannot go after two Roman citizens and meet justice to them through their own court systems. That would create a response from Rome that they want no part of. But look at what they said. These men has caused trouble all over, not just Asia Minor, not just the Jewish community, the world. So Paul and Silas have created problems throughout the world. Okay. So I guess they follow the theory of don't let facts get in your way, go hard. Okay. And they are defying Caesar's decrees. Okay. Now we got trouble all over the world, and we're defying Caesar's decrees. Check, checkmate. And we'll pick up there next week. Thanks. How you been?
So what's the odds that these guys are professional agitators that are just following Paul and Silas around?
Appears pretty high. Appears really high, actually.
You're gonna get them.
And it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. It happens elsewhere where it says.